Hello and welcome to the At-Sea Podcast. I'm your host, Justin McRoberts, and I'm just eating breakfast. I'm your host, Justin McRoberts, and I'm also my very own guest. If you've been around these parts for any amount of time, you know that this podcast started a number of years ago in an interview format, and I was talking to people that were working in fields that were doing work in fields that I thought would be helpful for you and I, folks who are navigating territory in politics and in art and religion and leadership. Over the course of time and in the last season, we've taken that to a more direct approach. We've taken a more direct approach to that, which is I'm taking questions from you, mostly on Instagram, and then bringing those questions here to the podcast, a few of them, to dig in a little bit deeper. The whole point of this is I want to be as helpful as I possibly can, which is why I coach and I offer spiritual direction. Is becoming 50 changed some things in me. When I became 50, some things in me changed. Probably the better way to say that. And all these years of me building and creating and putting my name on things it's been just fine, but I'd like to spend the latter half of my life helping you develop what's going on in you and helping you achieve your thing and becoming who you were becoming. So this podcast is now part of that. I'm going to kick it off with a couple questions from Instagram, and then I will actually pivot to some things that came up in between these questions. I'm learning as I go along as well how I want to be doing this. This first question actually comes up quite a bit in different formats, and the question is, how can I best create a spiritual practice for myself after leaving a hurtful church environment? And my suggestion here is always to go get some help first. In other words, work with a spiritual director, maybe work with a coach, work with someone who can help you develop those patterns. One of the reasons we settle into and need community is because our hearts, our souls, our minds are not designed to practice religion alone. We're not good at it, in part there are a lot of reasons for that. The long and the short of it is I don't see myself clearly and well, and I don't evaluate my own self clearly and well, and I don't see God as clearly or as well as I do if I'm working with someone else who can watch me from the outside, who can see patterns in my life more clearly than I see them for myself. So practicing life and religion in a community is one of the deep, deep benefits of actually being in a church setting. When there's hurt in that church setting, sometimes, if not often, part of what goes on in our bodies and our souls is we have a bit of an aversion to that power dynamic. I don't want to give any part, sometimes. I don't want to give part of my process over to someone else. I don't want to relinquish power to someone else because I got hurt. One of the gifts of spiritual direction and of good coaching is that these are folks who don't need you to get anywhere specific. These are folks who as opposed to sometimes pastoral care has a strategic vision. This is where I'm taking my church, and if you're in my church, this is where we're headed. That's not a bad thing, but once we've been hurt in an environment like that, going to a pastor and asking for spiritual care can sometimes put us back in a position in which this person is really actually honestly trying to get somewhere and achieve certain things. Versus in spiritual direction or in coaching, the primary job is what's going on with you. And we don't need you to get anywhere. We need you to get well and then figure yourself out, learn to hear God for yourself, and then decide in your core, this is more of a coaching thing, decide in your core, where do you want to go somewhere? Where do you want to go? Where do you want to head from here? What do you want to build? So we will always need to relinquish part of our process to someone else. Part of spiritual formation over time is the relinquishing of power to God and to others. I don't get to forge my own spiritual path. I think that's a super weird, backwards notion of what spiritual formation looks like. I don't get to make these decisions for myself over time. What I want to do is I want to put myself in a posture to be cared for, to be seen, to be known by the divine and by loving and caring people. At some point, after I have been hurt in that kind of power dynamic, I have to work myself back into a place where my soul, my body, my subconscious, my conscious all trust the relinquishing of that power again. Totally understand that that's difficult. That's why spiritual direction is such a wonderful gift in this season of life where so many of us have felt injured or hurt or betrayed in some way, shape, or form in religious power dynamics. Which brought me to the second part of the question, the second part of my answer to the question, for which I got a little bit of pushback over messages, which I understand. That's totally fine. This is the kind of pushback that doesn't always happen in public. What I suggested was that long-term forgiveness toward the places you were hurt, or the forgiveness toward the people who hurt you, will actually set you free for your own process. A few quick notes here. I fully believe that. When I am hurt by someone else, and I carry that resentment, that anger towards that other person, resentment and anger are really strong forces in my soul, and they tend to have enough gravity that other things will start revolving around them. So the decisions I'm making about religion, about relationship, about money, if I've been hurt in those spheres, the decisions I'm making will revolve around that hurt, that anger. What forgiveness does, it doesn't let those people off the hook. By the way, that's not forgiveness. That's just letting someone off the hook. What forgiveness does is it actually decenters the power of that injury in my soul so that I can actually make decisions and hear clearly in my own heart, soul strength. I can hear clearly in my own heart, soul, and psychology. It doesn't have to happen right away, because sometimes the hurt, it lasts and it's hard to get to a place of forgiveness, but letting go of this, decentering that anger, decentering the resentment that I have, frees that space up to belong to me again and to belong to God again. So long as resentment or anger towards someone else exists in my soul, that part of my life, I'm so sorry to say this, that part of my life, that part of my soul kind of belongs to someone else. And I'm granting someone else and their injury power over me in my decision making today. That can last for a little while, but I really don't think it should last for very long. So, one way to think about this, and I'm going to blank on the person who said this. So I've heard this from a mentor friend and boss of mine named Donna Hadasaki, who says, who's borrowing this from someone else for sure, who says that forgiveness is giving someone else permission to not be God. Those power centers in us should be places in which you and I and God are making decisions about who we are and where we're going. So forgiveness for the places where we've been religiously hurt, I would suggest is, in the long run, entirely essential to forming and forging a new pathway forward spiritually and religiously. So that was the first question. The second question was how to maintain healthy boundaries and expectations as an admin for religious organizations. This is I get to this a little bit in the next book. So not the book In Rest, which you can get right now. It's a collection of poems about the practice of rest. I enjoyed putting it in the world. And not even the book before that, called Sacred Strides, which actually works really well with In Rest. It's a nice pairing. Merry Christmas. You should buy that for your family. Several copies. In the fall of 2025, Scott Erickson and I are releasing a brand new book that we're calling In the Low, and it's prayers for seasons of depression and anxiety. And part of what we get to, in an essay I wrote, has to do with meaningful work. And what we discover over time what I have discovered over time is that there is no meaning in work. So when we work for nonprofits, or when we work for religious orgs, we dive into places where places like that. Part of the assumption is that there's meaning in that work and that meaning is intrinsic. What I have discovered is that insofar as work is a discipline of mine and a spiritual discipline, the meaning part is actually something that happens between God and me in my soul as I do that work. So there isn't meaning. I'm getting to the answer to this thing, I promise. There isn't meaning in the work somewhere, like in the nonprofit somewhere, that if I dig around long enough I will discover and then get to add to my life. The meaning is me being met by God in that work, me discovering who I am, as I'm being formed by God in that work, and then seeing God in that work as a participant, which is really about me, my freedom, my joy. In other words, meaning when it comes to work, I would suggest is an internal experience of work rather than a thing I pull out of the work itself over there and then get to add to my life. All of this is important because that's part of how we distance ourselves. It's part of what it takes to create boundaries and have healthier expectations for nonprofit or religious work, is I'll attach myself to something because I think there's meaning in it that is more important than the meaning in my heart, my soul, my mind. And that's not true. And I don't think that's a healthy Christian perspective. I don't think that's a healthy religious perspective. I'll say it this way to folks, that there is no work ever that you are ever called to that is more important to God than you are while you do the work. And part of how we dissociate ourselves from that expectation is to stop thinking that there's meaning in there that I have now attached myself to, that there's meaning in doing nonprofit work and rescuing kids from slavery. Is it meaningful to do that? Yes, and we can get all the way into the weeds about that. But the deepest meaning for me as I participate in a work even like rescuing kids from slavery has to do with bearing witness to, being in relationship to, and discovering the presence of the divine in my heart, my soul, my mind, my life, and my world. God is concerned with who I am while I do the work. That's the primary meaning. So, long philosophical way to get around to this kind of short answer is it's important for us to stop putting so much pressure on certain jobs or certain roles as if those things hold meaning in and of themselves. So work with a coach to identify some of the patterns. So when you talk about drawing better boundaries or having better expectations, that probably means there are some pattern behaviors with regards to how you spend your time, what time you show up, what time you leave, like all that kind of stuff. It's probably important to get into the actual weeds of that and like look at the patterns that you've developed as you try to serve this very meaningful work, and then actionably do both things. One, like embrace internally like a mantra that the true meaning of doing that work has to do with your relationship with God and not the work itself. And then find the specific practices of like fasting from certain kinds of behaviors after work or certain kind of associations after work. Attaching that philosophical piece to really specific practices. There is no meaning in a particular work intrinsically. The only meaning there ever is in work is human meaning in relationship to God. And your participation in that work, like you get to actually be part of how that thing plays out. You're not a tool in God's tool belt through which He's accomplishing something more important than you are. I think that's dangerous thinking. Last one for today has to do this question, which again has come up a few times. What are your thoughts on evangelicals converting to Catholicism? I think it's not just Catholicism, but although I do know several folks who have converted to Catholicism. Converted to Catholicism. I think the movement from evangelicalism to more liturgical and practice-based religions or expressions of religion, it makes a lot of sense. And it's not because evangelicalism, I'll say this, it's not because evangelicalism is just ripely corrupt. That might be true. I don't know if I buy that analysis. I think that's a little bit much. I think there is an overarching cultural maturation happening among a lot of folks who grew up in evangelical settings and developed a taste for the experiences and expressions of evangelicalism, and were comfortable with the attachments of evangelicalism. And as we have become adults, we don't want to be as dependent on those those expressions or those experiences. There's a lot about evangelicalism that is about experience. It's about experiencing worship. We go to these rock shows and it's about the experience of the moment. Even the way we craft sermons is about kind of creating this moment, this sort of, and all that's fine. But at some point in our maturation as adults, what we want is we want to have a connection with God that isn't predicated on experience. We want it to be an actual relationship. And the historical disciplines at the centerpiece at the center or near the heart of Catholicism or moral liturgical practices, instead of creating experiences, they actually just hold space for us more loosely so that we can forge a relationship with God that doesn't have to feel a certain way. I think that's part of why so many folks are moving away from evangelicalism to practices like Catholicism. Yes, I think it has to some degree, has something to do with corruption and power and like alignment with certain politics and all. I think that's part of it. I also think part of it is that we're growing up a little bit and we want there to be a more mature posture in our souls in relationship to God and to ourselves. So there you go. We'll just hit those three for now. Thank you for joining me on this episode of the @C podcast. If you want to submit a question, follow me at Instagram. Feel free to find me somewhere else. Actually, I've gotten a couple emails from folks who've got some questions as well. But I'm enjoying this quite a bit, and I hope you are as well. So until next time.